Hello the world, hello the internet, hello Jason Isaacs. This is Paul Talks Politics. I'm Paul and I'm going to be talking politics. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the PM and government. This is going to be a big one. So brace yourselves because we're going to go into a lot of detail. Having said that, I'm not going to go into all of the possible detail. In fact, there's a few other videos that I'm going to link off to at the end that will hope to bring a little more context and evidence into what could be quite a structural and theoretical argument here. But enough of that. We'll get into that when we get back from the intro. So cue the music and I'll see you the other side of this. See you in a minute. Bye now. So hi, if this is your first time here, I'm Paul, I talk politics, and this is my YouTube channel, Paul Talks Politics. Please do like and subscribe, tell your friends, and if you don't like it, tell me in the comments underneath. I'm man enough to take that. Today, as I said in the introduction, we're going to look at PM and government. This is going to be quite a big subject. There's a lot of stuff out there to talk about, and so I'll link off to a few other videos that add a bit more context. I'm going to try to keep this one fairly theoretical, but there's going to be some evidence in it as well. But let's just see where it goes. Before we start with anything else, if you've been to my channel before, you'll know that I recognise three types of sovereignty in the UK. First of all, we've got political sovereignty. Now that attends to the people. We are the political sovereigns. All political authority flows from us through the rest of the model, not from the sun, the moon, and the stars, not from the giant volcano, not from the big spaghetti monster, not from God. All political authority in this country flows from us. We are a democracy, and a democracy is a system of government predicated on popular sovereignty. Simples. We then take all that sovereignty, we bundle it up, and we give it to the legal sovereigns. That's Parliament. Parliament gets to make, amend, or set aside any legislation it sees fit, and nobody gets to muck with Parliament's legislation, nor can they create binding legislation of their own. That is the nature of parliamentary sovereignty, and they are the legal sovereigns. And then sitting on top of that, we've got policy sovereignty. Policy sovereignty is about taking action. It's about deciding what to do. It's about setting the agenda. And in our system, we have Parliament. Parliament gives that authority to government. Somebody needs to be steering the ship. And in the UK model, it's the government that steers the ship. They have policy agenda. They decide what's going to happen every morning when they get up and go to work. Government is there to set the agenda, to take action. And that's why they have policy sovereignty. In order to be legitimate, they need to exercise that policy sovereignty through Parliament, because all of their authority is derived from Parliament. That is the nature of this concept of parliamentary sovereignty. Government has no intrinsic authority. Remember, nobody voted for government. We all vote for our MPs. And it's the party that's got the most MPs in the House of Parliament that gets to decide who goes into government. So that's how our system works. So what exactly does it mean to exercise that concept of policy sovereignty? Well, basically, the government determines the national priorities. It decides what it's going to do. Now, it presumably will have contested the election on a manifesto, and that forms the basis of the agenda when they first get into power. They then take those ideas into Parliament and they present them to Parliament, say, here, this is what we'd like to do. Will you please give us the legislation that will allow us to do it? Because the government cannot act except through Parliament, except in very special circumstances that I think, probably get into in this particular presentation. The key thing is that the government cannot create legislation. Only Parliament can create legislation because they are the sovereigns. But having created that legislation then goes back to government, and government promulgates or puts that legislation into effect, which means that they are then responsible for enforcing the laws that Parliament has created. That's what it means to have policy sovereignty, and that is essentially what the government does. Having established at a very basic level what the government does, well, let's look at exactly what they are. And we're going to dig into government and the three main parts of that, if you will, PM, cabinet, and we're going to talk about the civil service as well. So this is what people used to do in politics before we had Brexit and coronavirus and other crazy stuff like this. This was published by The Guardian, and you can see it there in 2011, 2012. And so the numbers have gone up quite significantly. The numbers have gone up to about £1 trillion, if I remember correctly. You'll be able to look that one up yourselves and see exactly how much it is that the government raises in tax revenue and then spends later. I haven't been able to find a more up-to-date one of these. If someone finds one out there, then do please let me know. But the agenda has kind of moved on from 2011, 2012, and people have less time and resources to do this sort of thing. But this is what government looks like, and you can see here how the various different departments of government spend money, how much it costs, for instance, to run the Department of Work and Pensions, how much the Department of Health costs. Now, obviously, that's pre-COVID, so that's gone up. And, over here, I haven't got my specs on, so I can't really see, and my specs are broken as well. So things like the NHS, obviously going to be an awful lot more. Revenue and Customs, education, 52 million. That just gives you a sort of idea of the ratios of numbers that we're talking about and the responsibility that government has when it comes to making these decisions. How much money are you going to raise? How are you going to spend it? These are the decisions that government makes. It then takes those decisions to Parliament and says, please will you give us the laws that will enable us to do this? And then basically everything goes back and forward and we wind up in this sort of situation. So the executive in the UK, the government in the UK, we've got to divide that into two sections straight away. We've got the political and we've got the permanent. Now the political, these are the politicians that we all know. These are individuals who have contested seats in Parliament or who are sitting in the House of Lords, who are taken out of the legislature and parked in government where they do specific jobs in specific departments. Now, critically, unlike the United States, they retain their seat in the legislature, so they're basically wearing two hats. They have one hat, which is their legislature hat, and they have a different hat, which is when they're in government. So even if you like, you've got you've got Rishi Sunak, who is of course the Prime Minister, who is also MP for Sedgefield. You've got Alex Chalk, who is the Justice Secretary, and he is also the MP for Cheltenham. So we have that fused executive. You can only be in the executive in the UK if you are, certainly in the government, in the political executive, you can only be in that executive if you are currently sitting in Parliament, either in Commons or indeed in the House of Lords. The government needs representatives from the House of Lords to take their policies into the House and to steer them through whatever process might be going on. So the number of ministers is capped at, I think it's 107. Those are the numbers, that's the maximum number of people who can draw a government salary. You'll have a PM. The numbers of specific secretaries of state will change depending upon the shape of the government that the Prime Minister wants. That's part of the Prime Minister's prerogative. And then, you have these various other ministers. And we'll talk about the ministerial pyramid in a little while. That's the political side. The permanent side, these are the civil servants. These are the ones that normally you wouldn't know about. Now, right now, we're seeing an awful lot of civil servants because we are in the throes of the COVID inquiry, and a lot of civil servants who would normally be operating behind the scenes have been dragged out of the shadows and have been parked right in front of my learned friends, and they are currently giving evidence at these hearings. Now, this is very, very unusual. Normally, we don't hear anything from civil servants because, as we shall come on to explain, they are anonymous and they are permanent. But we will get to that in just 1 second. So why do we have these political and permanent things? Well, the great thing about the civil service is it doesn't change. And of course, the nature of the political is that it does change. And so right now, obviously, Sunak is in charge. He's been in since October 2022. But before him, we had briefly the famous administration of Truss, which lasted all of, 45 days. Now, the question is, what did any of these guys know about government? The answer was clearly very, very little. And so when they came in theory, they would be relying upon the advice of the permanent, who have been in this job before. we know that they didn't. In fact, they went out of their way to ignore the advice of their civil servants, and that didn't work particularly well. But even before then, we had the Johnson administration, and again, we had the same civil service behind the scenes, in theory, advising. And then before then, we had this lot in briefly, and that came after that lot. So even as the executive churns, the permanent civil service remains the same. So at some point, presumably fairly soon, Sunak will be off, and who knows who will have in charge. But the permanent civil service will still be there advising the government as best they possibly can. So this is what our traditional model of the civil service is. For those of you who don't know, this is from Yes Prime Minister. That's the Prime Minister. That's his PPS, and that's the Cabinet Secretary. So the idea is that here's the Prime Minister making all of the decisions, and then behind him are these very, very learned, very, very professional civil servants. And the key thing is that they are anonymous. The civil servants are not supposed to be held responsible for mistakes. Their job is to advise the ministers. The ministers then make the decision. So they'll say, in theory, to the minister, well, you could do this or you could do that. And the minister is there to exercise judgment. And so it's the judgment that is accountable, not the advice. And again, they are supposed to be permanent. That is to say that they are always there. They don't change every time you have an election. And so in theory, we have this institutional level of expertise and professionalism, and they are apolitical. That is that they do their job without fear or favour, without any political bias or any political agenda. So they will be advising ministers on an even-handed basis. That's the civil service. I don't really plan on going into it in much more detail. We'll touch upon it later a little bit. You need to know about it for the exam. Are you going to get a question on the civil service? No, probably not directly, but it may be that you need to refer to it on the way through. Critically, anonymous, permanent, and neutral. Those are the principles of the civil service. Those are being sorely tested all the time. But really, this is for your information rather than sort of pure exam capital. So, let's talk about the political now. Let's talk about the political ministers. Now, this is from a couple of weeks ago, because since this was done, this was literally, I think, summer, sometime in the summer, because since then Rab's gone, and he has been replaced by Alex Chalk, and Ben Wallace has retired, and he's been replaced remarkably by Grant Shapps. So that's created a move there. So Kemi Badenoch's gone over to business, creating space there. And I can't remember who international trade is now. I should know that. Michelle Donlan is now off to science. So this is an organic document. So what I suggest you do is that with this, and Nadim's gone, and he's been replaced by Greg Hands again. Strange days. We will come back to Cabinet in a second. We'll come back to these ministers in a second. But clearly what we're talking about here is Cabinet. And Cabinet is the decision-making that sits right in the middle of the British government system. It's the PM, it's the senior secretaries of state, various other ministers who have the right to attend Cabinet. But this is where the decisions are made. This is where collectively these people who are supposedly the best and the brightest out of the current crop of MPs sit around this very big table here and make decisions. In addition to that, the Cabinet Secretary is attending there. He is there. He is supposed really just to be the referee, to advise on technical matters. He doesn't really take part in discussion. Remember, the key thing about the civil service is they're not there to make decisions. They are there simply to advise. And so he's sitting there, in theory, advising. What we know now he was doing, certainly in the Johnson administration, was sending rude texts onto the table to his mates explaining how terrible the government was, which you don't generally expect of a cabinet secretary. So this is a relatively up-to-date version by the looks of it. You can see all the major suspects sitting around the table there, and decisions presumably are being made at this point. So, critically, when it comes to these cabinet discussions, power is held collectively by cabinet. Cabinet is an executive decision-making body, and then within that, the Prime Minister is held to be primus inter pares, that is, first among equals. Now, if you know what that means, well done, because I don't. And this is one of the key problems with British government. That slap bang in the middle of the whole system, we have an oxymoron or an inconsistency. You can't be first among equals. And what that invites is each Prime Minister to decide how they want to run their cabinet. There is no constitutional mechanism that describes how primus inter pares is supposed to work. It's entirely for the Prime Minister to decide how he wants to run it, and for Cabinet to decide how much they're prepared to tolerate. And that is the shape that determines everything else that follows from British government, where power lies, how these decisions are made. It all hangs on this idea of primus inter pares and what it means as we move from one administration to the next, from one Prime Minister to the next, from one Cabinet to the next. So speaking of which, I've left this one blank. And what I suggest is that you get a hard copy of this, and then just before you go into the exam, you give yourself an up-to-date version, because rest assured, it's not going to look like this. This is what government looks like in the UK at the minute. This is from August 23. These are our departments, and these are the officers who are entitled to attend cabinet. And here, well, it's all explained very, very nicely over here. So these ones sitting around here, this is cabinet. So this is Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I'm going up from the bottom. Department of Transport, Department of Education, Department of Work and Pensions, Department of Business and Trade, Department of Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs, that's COFRI, Leader of the House of Commons, Leader of the House of Lords, Department of Health and Social, DHS, Department of Health and something else, can't remember what that is. Gove is he is the head of the Department of Levelling Up. I can't believe that's actually in there. Dunellan is Science and Technology. Shapps is in what we looked at him earlier. Oh gosh, I can't. What? He's Foreign Secretary. Goodness gracious. Yes, he's Foreign Secretary, because Cleverly is still Foreign Secretary. I'm losing track of this myself. It's we did have it earlier. Whoops. Yes, so Shapps is Grant Shapps there. He's the business. That's it. I can't remember what the Z stands for. But blah 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 blah. It changes all the time, as you can see. Department of Health there. That's Braverman, and the ones in the red, they attend cabinet. The ones in pink can attend cabinet. And the ones in pink, the ones in blue, just they don't get invited because they're way down the pecking order. Yes, that's it. It is confusing, and we all get it wrong from time to time. Let's zero in on education, just so we have an idea of what's going on. And again, this is correct as of November 2023. Gillian Keegan is still in her job. So these are the political side of the Education Department. This is the Minister, the Secretary of State for Education. Gillian Keegan attends Cabinet. Her remit is everything to do with education. And then under her, she has various other ministers who are taking care of particular areas, and you can see those there. So this is the political side. And at some point, presumably in the next 18 months or so, we'll have a general election. Chances are the Conservatives will lose, and so these lot will be out if they've lasted that long. The permanent will still be there, and they will still have that institutional memory, institutional understanding, so that when the next lot come in, they will be able to advise and guide presumably whoever the Labour Secretary of State for Education is at that time, and it will be the front bench spokesman whose name I can't remember, but that will be the situation. We'll have a new Secretary of State for Education, and obviously further ministers from whichever party wins the election taking over there. Of course, Before that happens, Sunak could decide to have a reshuffle, at which point any or more of these lot could be out of a job or promoted or demoted. That is again the Prime Minister's prerogative, and we've seen a remarkable churn of cabinet ministers in the last several months. And there's a fantastic video on Sky TV, which I will link off to in the description, just going through some of that churn that we have seen of late. But, this is Gillian Keegan. She is, again, in charge of everything to do with education in the UK. And I'm sure she's a very smart cookie, but there's not much there that suggests she is equipped to run a school, never mind all of education in the UK. But she's not supposed to. Her job there is to make decisions, and in making decisions she is being advised by Susan Ackland-Hurd, who is the Chief Secretary at the Education Department. And and that's her CV. And there's more stuff there to do with education, so one has to hope that she knows a little bit more about education than Gillian Keegan does, and so that Gillian Keegan is getting the right sort of advice in her day-to-day decision making. I'm not sure either of them really know much about RAC, but that's a whole different matter. Okay, just want to break from that for a second to talk about special political advisors. Now, there's a lot of content on this slide, and I really don't want to do this. I try to do it as infrequently as possible, but I don't want to get derailed by SPADs. But they are out there. The big difference between a SPAD and a civil servant, if you go back to the three characteristics of the civil service, they are permanent, they are anonymous, and they are neutral. Seem to be having a power cut. So they're anonymous, they're apolitical, and they are permanent. That's it. SPADs are not permanent. They serve at the pleasure of the minister, and they're not apolitical. Their advice is always political in nature. It might be dressed up as statecraft, but fundamentally it's about what is right politically rather than what is right for the city, for the country at the time. And of course, nowhere is that being more clearly illustrated than in the COVID inquiry right now, where we're seeing Dominic Cummings and Lee Cain. They were both SPADs. They were not civil servants. Their job was essentially to protect their political masters, but clearly they decided that they didn't want to do that, and they turned on them, and it then got incredibly messy. So if you're not following the COVID inquiry right now, you really should be. But there you go, just a little bit about SPADs. We come back and look at them again later, but I don't want to get entirely derailed by that right now. Right, so government, functional analysis. What does government do? What is cabinet government? What is the Prime Minister's role? And what is this thing called collective ministerial responsibility? Again, we mentioned earlier that when it comes to cabinet, the structure is such that power is held collectively and the Prime Minister is primus inter pares. The job of cabinet is to coordinate policy, to decide what's going to be done, and then to coordinate it across all of the various departments that exist within government. How does the Prime Minister himself or herself control cabinet? Well, Prime Minister's in control of agenda. They decide what's discussed, when it's discussed, where it's discussed, and for how long. Now, that might not seem particularly interesting or powerful, but when you've been in a few meetings and you suddenly see the agenda and how things are either getting shunted around or off, and you're thinking, hang on a second, I thought we were talking about this. Control of the agenda is a very, very powerful mechanism. And this was particularly key when we look at Thatcher and Westland. That's generally the idea of, that's your gun example, if you will, of control of the agenda. Although later on, of course, it morphs entirely when we move into the Blair administration and decisions are being made somewhere other than cabinet entirely. But in the Westland affair in 1986, the our protagonists were Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister, and Michael Heseltine, who was the head of trade, if I remember correctly. And we had Westland. Westland was a failing helicopter company. Michael Heseltine wanted to discuss at Cabinet the fate. He wanted Westland to be sold to a European consortium. Thatcher didn't, and so she took it off the agenda. Heseltine threw a massive hissy fit and resigned in high dudgeon, and Thatcher went, okay, fair enough, and then later sold Westland to an American consortium instead. So there you go, that's one example of control of the agenda. Again, in the case of Blair, we've got so many examples of the agenda, Cabinet coming into decisions that had already been made elsewhere, notably the Iraq War at one end of the scale and the Millennium Dome at another end of the scale. So control of the agenda is very, very important, and it's a key mechanism for prime ministerial control of Cabinet. Of course, the other obvious thing is hiring and firing. Prime Minister has control of patronage, that is prerogative power. Ministers, in theory, are appointed by the Crown, but of course it's the Prime Minister who gets to decide them, so they get to decide who they're going to pluck out from government, or from Parliament, and park in Cabinet, who's going to get promoted, who's going to get demoted, and who's going to get fired. Yeah, and again, we've seen quite a lot of that, so I'm not going to go into that right now. There is a network of committees that supports Cabinet. That is the Cabinet committee structure. Some are more important than others, Foreign Affairs being very important, Treasury Committee being very important. And so the Prime Minister gets to decide who sits on these various committees, and it's a way sort of judging your progress up and down the ministerial ladder, because be assured there is a hierarchy. We do have the four great offices of state, that is Prime Minister, Home Office, Foreign Office, and Chancellor of the Exchequer. Those are the four big ones, and then there's various degrees of authority off the back of that. The Prime Minister decides who goes where, and of course that makes them very important. And then you can also track your progress through the committee system, because just as there's a hierarchy of ministers, there's a hierarchy of committees as well. And referring something to committee is a way that the Prime Minister can basically kill something, just kill it in committee, gets off the agenda, and people forget about it, and the news cycle moves on. Now, one important thing we do need to talk about, and that is collective responsibility. If you're in government, not just if you're in Cabinet, but if you are a government minister of any size or shape, then you have to agree with the decisions that are being made. You can't disagree and remain in government, particularly so in Cabinet. If you're in Cabinet, you have to be prepared to defend a policy in public, and indeed on the record everybody has to agree that they have put their name to this. If you disagree with a policy vehemently, if you cannot reconcile your position with that particular policy, then you have no choice but to resign. And I think in a couple of slides we'll look at exactly what that means. Cabinet is very much dominated by the Prime Minister. However, that said, Cabinet can sometimes fight back. The key issue with this whole concept of primus inter pares is, yes, it's how much the Prime Minister, how the Prime Minister wants to run it, and also how much the Cabinet is prepared to take. So we have individual resignations, normally not a big deal. However, Geoffrey Howe, his resignation in 1990 was indeed a very, very big deal, because he had been a staunch supporter of Thatcher for a long time, and he also delivered a devastating speech in Parliament that really fired the gun on the end of the Thatcher administration, fired the gun that started the race to end the Thatcher administration. However, it was collective pressure in the end that told Thatcher that she had to go. She lost the lead. Well, she didn't lose the leadership contest, but she didn't win it by sufficient convincing margin, and Cabinet turned around and said, look, sorry, you've got to go. Your authority is spent. Cabinet also ran out of patience with Tony Blair in 2008. Worth mentioning that the Parliamentary Labour Party never lost patience with Tony Blair, because they knew that they were all in Parliament because of him, not because of anything else that was going on. But there were various machinations within Cabinet that I explore in different videos where people basically said, look, Tony, you've got to go, largely because Brown was impossible to live with. The TBGBs had spiraled out of all control, and so cabinet was essentially dysfunctional because Brown was refusing to play by any sort of conventional rules and making life impossibly difficult, not only for Blair but for anybody else in cabinet who was on Blair's side. Then we have mass resignations, and Brown turned out to be, unfortunately, not a tremendously good Prime Minister. We had mass resignations in 2010. We also had mass resignations, obviously, from the May administration as we went into 2009, and then from the Johnson administration in 2022. So Cabinet can individually do very little, but when they gang up, when a Prime Minister is really hanging by a thread, then Cabinet becomes a much more powerful entity. A little bit more about ministerial responsibility, the idea there that they're all equally responsible for those decisions that are being made, but also every individual minister is responsible for two things. First of all, their own behaviour, and also then for the performance of their department. Now, if it all goes spectacularly wrong and you're a minister, then you are expected to resign. You're expected to hang up your boots and go on and do something else. Issues of collective responsibility are very rare, or at least they were until we had Brexit. We have famously, as then again there, Geoffrey Howe, who resigned over Thatcher's position on Europe. We got Robin Cook, who resigned over the Iraq War, and David Davis in 2016 resigning over Brexit, and a few others followed suit. Notably somebody called Johnson. Yeah, what happened to him? Individual responsibility, we tend to have more of those, and often for a combination of performance and personal decorum. Famously, Lord Carrington resigned in 1982 after Argentina invaded the Falklands, catching everybody by surprise, but very nobly he assumed responsibility for that and resigned his position. Amber Rudd resigned over the Windrush affair in 2018, which wasn't her fault. That was actually something that had been done by the previous Home Secretary, somebody called Theresa May, but there we go. It was Amber Rudd who was in the controls when the thing broke, and so she had to carry the can for that. Then you got a slew of people who have resigned for principled reasons. Being unprincipled rather, decorum. Priti Patel lying about meetings, unscheduled meetings and unauthorized meetings with foreign dignitaries. Matt Hancock, well, we all know about him, but the list is endless when it comes to this particular form. It's probably the least interesting part of the whole equation. So as I said, the key thing here is how much does the Prime Minister want to take control, and how much control is Cabinet prepared to take. That's a famous video there that I will link off to involving Mrs. Thatcher and the vegetables. The key thing here is about case studies, about looking at these various case studies, looking at the way in which each Prime Minister has tried to run their cabinet, and the way in which that may or may not have succeeded, how much cabinet was prepared to take, and the point at which they finally said, actually no, we're not taking any more of that. I explore a lot of these in my other videos, but good idea for you to have something up your sleeve on all of those. Finally, just a little exercise to try for yourself. Just imagine for a second that you're the Prime Minister and you are facing a global pandemic. Who do you want around this table? Whose advice are you going to listen to? Well, we start off, here's our Prime Minister. You're sitting there, well, you're not in the middle, you're kind of off to the left, but who are you going to have around you? Well, presumably, you're going to want to have the heads of these particular very, very important areas, because whatever decision you'll make, we're looking at a global pandemic that's going to affect the national finances, and you may want to shut down schools, so that's going to include the part of personal education. Obviously it's a health crisis, so you want the Department of Health in, and then you're going to have a lockdown, so you need the Home Office, because they're going to be responsible for trying to police this particular exercise. Justice, well, they're going to get involved because you're going to be creating a huge raft of new rules and regulations, and so they're going to be responsible again for being on the other side of the Home Office. When the Home Office start arresting people, that's going to wind up in the Justice Department, and so they're going to have to deal with it as well. Business and trade, well, if you're locking down, that's going to have a massive impact on business and trade, so obviously you're going to want to have them involved. And we're going to have to deal with our friends and neighbors overseas, because I don't know, maybe people are flying in with this virus. So immediately you can see that this decision is going to require a concerted and joined up affair, because tackling a pandemic is not just the role of the Department of Health. So you've got to have some very, very smart people around the table getting very, very smart advice. Just go back to the start of the pandemic and look at who was sitting in all of those seats and see whether or not you think we had the best people in place for the job. And then remember that each of these people has getting two different types of advice. They're getting advice from the civil servants. Now these guys, no one's been through a pandemic before, but these people presumably have been working in this department, in health, in education, in the Home Office for many, many years, and they have a degree of expertise in this particular area. And so they're going to be saying, well, look, Minister, what we advise, let's just look at education. So what we advise for the kids is this. If you're going to lock down schools, then you're going to have this, and this to deal with, and you will have to make this decision and that decision. You're going to have to make a decision on exams. You're going to have to make a decision on access. You're going to have to make a decision on these kids who rely on school for their free school meals. These decisions ripple out in all sorts of areas. And you're getting advice, hopefully, from the civil servants, but don't forget, you're also getting advice from your SPADs, who are saying to you, well, look, if you make that decision, you may as well resign now because your career's finished. So as we move into a big political issue like this, there are so many different competing agendas and there's so many different voices. And of course, it's not just that lot. The Prime Minister is also getting advice from their civil service and from their SPADs. And in this case, your SPAD is Dominic Cummings. That's a terrifying idea. And then you've also got, just to add one more last thing, you've got the Cabinet Office, which is the sort of idea where all of the civil servants are supposed to come together, coordinate all of this work that's going on outside. And I think we start to see the magnitude of the task and just how important it is to have the right people in the right place at the right time. So who did we have? We had Matt Hancock. We had Rishi Sunak. We had Gavin Williamson. Oh, good God. It was catastrophic. And this is what we're seeing now. With the COVID inquiry. As a politics teacher, you're supposed to be balanced. It's hard to be balanced in these particular circumstances, particularly when we looked at what happened in education and the fact that Williamson didn't resign. Anyway, that's a conversation for a whole different ball game. We'll leave that for the time being. This conversation has gone on for far, far, far too long. If you've made it this far, thank you very, very much. Like and subscribe. If you didn't like it, let me know. Tell me in the comments. I'm big enough and bad enough to deal with that. And watch out, because I'm going to link off to some more videos that will hopefully guide you through what is a very, very tricky and technical process. But thanks for your time and good luck. Let me know your questions and I'll get on to them as soon as I possibly can. Cue the outro and see you in the next video.